Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time to an era of gas lamps, hushed parlors, and exquisitely painful fashion choices, the Victorian era. Imagine yourself now, perhaps in a dimly lit drawing room, the scent of lavender and coal smoke lingering faintly in the air. You're eyeing a lady across the room, her silhouette a perfect hourglass, her complexion like freshly fallen snow. And you can't help but wonder, how did they do that? You see, the Victorian era wasn't just about rigid social rules. It was about rigid beauty rules, too. And you, my friend, with your modern sensibilities and preference for comfort, probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in a Victorian lady's dressing room without a mild panic attack. Seriously, you'd be looking for the nearest exit faster than a forgotten hat in a strong breeze. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to imagine us all, scattered across the globe, drifting off to the same gentle historical murmurs. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our adventure tonight begins with the very essence of Victorian beauty, an almost ethereal delicacy. Think of a porcelain doll, delicate and pale, with a tiny waist and eyes that seem to hold a world of quiet contemplation. That, my dear listener, was the ideal. This wasn't a time for tanned, athletic physiques or robust, rosy cheeks. Oh no, the Victorian woman aspired to a sort of fragile elegance, a visible indication of her genteel upbringing and, crucially, her lack of manual labor. A pale complexion was paramount. It signaled that you didn't toil in the fields under the harsh sun. You weren't a common laborer. You were, instead, a lady of leisure, perhaps prone to a delightful swoon at the slightest provocation, though historians still argue whether these fainting spells were genuine fragility or a well-practiced social maneuver. This ideal of paleness permeated everything, from skincare routines to fashion choices. Women would carry parasols to shield themselves from the sun, even on mildly cloudy days, and wide-brim bonnets were not just fashionable, but a practical shield against the dreaded tanning rays. It's almost ironic, isn't it, how we chase the sun now, while they actively avoided it like a bill collector. You wouldn't catch a true Victorian lady intentionally basking in the sun. That was simply uncivilized. Imagine trying to explain sunscreen to them. They'd probably think it was some newfangled poison. And speaking of peculiar historical habits, did you know that some ancient civilizations, long before the Victorians, used crocodile dung as a form of sunscreen? Now, that would be a hard sell at the beauty counter today. But for the Victorians, the goal was luminescence, a soft, almost translucent quality to the skin that whispered of indoor pursuits and delicate constitutions. This pursuit of paleness often led to some rather inventive and sometimes concerning methods, which we'll gently explore as we continue our journey tonight. As you continue to envision this Victorian ideal of delicate paleness, you can almost feel the gentle squeeze of what was arguably the most iconic and perhaps most uncomfortable garment of the era, the corset. The corset. It wasn't just underwear. It was an architectural marvel, a social statement, and for many women, a daily test of endurance. Its sole purpose was to mold the female torso into the highly coveted hourglass shape, emphasizing a tiny waist, often cinched to an astonishing degree. Imagine trying to take a deep, satisfying breath when you're laced into what feels like a beautifully embroidered vice. You'd be subtly panting through polite conversation, probably blaming a sudden draft. The ideal waist size was often touted as anything from 18 to 22 inches, a figure that would make most modern individuals gasp for air just contemplating it. To achieve this, young girls often started wearing corsets at a relatively early age, gradually tightening them over the years. This process, known as tight lacing, was a mainstream practice, though historians still argue whether the extreme medical ailments attributed solely to corsets were truly widespread or exaggerated by sensationalist media of the time. While undoubtedly restrictive, The corset was also seen as a necessary foundation for the voluminous skirts and elaborate bodices that were fashionable. It provided support, improved posture, albeit a forced one, and created the desired silhouette for the era's grand dresses. Now, you might think of corsets as merely a tool of oppression, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. For some women, it was a symbol of their adherence to societal norms, a mark of respectability and femininity. It was a garment, in a way, that defined their very shape in the world. And let's be honest, who hasn't suffered for fashion? Remember those incredibly uncomfortable shoes you wore to that one event because they completed the look? Multiply that discomfort by about 100, add a dash of potential rib displacement, and you're getting closer to the Victorian corset experience. It wasn't just about the waist, either. Corsets also pushed up the bust and smoothed the hips, creating that distinct S-bend posture that was all the rage. It's almost like they were trying to turn themselves into a living, breathing sculpture. And speaking of sculptures, did you know some ancient Greek statues, particularly from the archaic period, depict figures with unnaturally narrow waists, suggesting that the desire for a cinched silhouette is far older than the Victorians? It seems the pursuit of an ideal shape is a timeless human endeavor, even if the methods change. Just be glad your only daily constriction is probably the elastic on your sweatpants. With the corset firmly in place, shaping the very foundation of the Victorian silhouette, your gaze would inevitably drift upwards to a woman's hair. Oh, the hair. It was less a casual coiffure and more an architectural feat, a testament to hours of dedication, skilled hands, and probably more hairpins than you could count. Victorian hair was almost universally long, often reaching the waist or even the floor, and was rarely, if ever, worn loose outside the home. To do so would have been considered utterly scandalous, almost disheveled. Imagine trying to sleep with all that hair, let alone manage it daily. You'd probably spend half your evening just detangling it, muttering under your breath about the unfairness of historical beauty standards. The ideal hairstyle was an elaborate updo, showcasing volume, intricate braids, rolls, and curls, often adorned with ribbons, feathers, or even fresh flowers for special occasions. Think of it as a carefully constructed nest atop the head, designed to convey respectability, femininity, and a certain demure charm. The sheer complexity meant that most women, particularly those of means, relied on maids or ladies' maids to help them manage and style their hair daily. It wasn't a quick brush and go. It was a ritual, a process that began with brushing, often 100 strokes or more, to distribute natural oils and encourage shine. This rigorous brushing was believed to be vital for hair health, though historians still argue whether it truly stimulated growth or merely polished the existing strands. And for those who weren't blessed with a natural abundance of hair, well, the Victorians were nothing if not resourceful. Hairpieces, known as rats or switches, made from real human hair, were incredibly popular. These weren't just for volume. They were expertly integrated into updos to create elaborate shapes and fullness that natural hair alone simply couldn't achieve. Sometimes a woman might even incorporate hair from family members, a rather charmingly macabre thought for our modern sensibilities. It was, in a way, the original hair extension industry, only without the brightly lit salons and celebrity endorsements. You might think of these hair additions as a form of gentle deception, but in the Victorian era, it was simply part of the accepted art of creating the ideal image. It's a little like how we might use volumizing mousse or dry shampoo today, just on a much grander and more time-consuming scale. Remember those ancient Egyptian wigs we discussed? The Victorians took that concept and ran with it, adding a healthy dose of repressed passion and rigid social norms. With the intricate updos perfectly coiffed, your attention would then inevitably be drawn to the canvas itself, the skin. And in the Victorian era, the ideal complexion was, as we've gently touched upon, an almost ghost-like paleness. This wasn't merely a preference, it was a deeply ingrained social indicator. A woman with a rosy, tan face might as well have been wearing a sign that read, "I work for a living," which for the aspiring Victorian lady was the ultimate faux pas. You were expected to exude an almost ethereal delicacy, a visible sign that your life was one of leisure, intellectual pursuits, and perhaps a delicate susceptibility to nervous ailments. Imagine trying to explain the concept of a healthy glow to them. They'd probably offer you smelling salts and a dark room. To achieve this coveted pallor, Victorian women resorted to a surprising array of methods, some benign, some decidedly less so. Avoiding the sun, as mentioned, was paramount. Parasols were essential accessories, even on cloudy days, and bonnets with wide brims shielded faces from any errant ray. Indoors, curtains were often drawn, and ladies might even wear face masks made of linen while sleeping to prevent any unwanted discoloration. It was a commitment, my friend, a full-time pursuit of the alabaster ideal. You might find yourself constantly ducking into shadows, perhaps even developing a slight fear of direct sunlight, like a particularly elegant vampire. Then there were the concoctions. Advertisements of the time promised miraculous whiteness, often containing ingredients that would make a modern dermatologist faint. Lead and arsenic were shockingly common components in skin-whitening creams and powders. While the Victorians didn't fully grasp the long-term toxicity of these substances, they certainly observed the immediate effects. A brightened complexion, albeit at the cost of eventual neurological damage, skin lesions, and organ failure. It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of beauty can, and often has, come with a hefty price. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of these toxic beauty products contributed significantly to the general ill health often attributed to Victorian women, or if other factors like poor sanitation and limited medical knowledge played a larger role. One quirky tidbit: some women would even consume tiny amounts of arsenic internally, believing it would give their skin a pearly luminescence and make their eyes sparkle. Yes, you heard that right, voluntarily ingesting poison for beauty. It makes that slightly uncomfortable face mask you occasionally wear seem positively luxurious by comparison. Remember how we talked about avoiding harsh words? Peculiar methods certainly applies here, doesn't it? Having established the ghostly pallor of the Victorian complexion, your gaze would naturally drift to the eyes. In an era where direct eye contact with strangers was often considered bold, even suggestive, a woman's eyes were still expected to be large, luminous, and expressive, hinting at a delicate sensibility and inner refinement. They were the windows to a soul that was meant to be pure and perhaps a little melancholic. Imagine trying to achieve luminous when you're half-starved from your corset and potentially poisoned by your face cream. It sounds like a challenge, doesn't it? To enhance their eyes, Victorian women used a variety of techniques, though subtly was key. Heavy, obvious makeup was considered vulgar, a mark of actresses or women of questionable reputation. Instead, the goal was to achieve a natural enhancement. Kohl, made from soot or antimony, was sometimes used to darken the lash line, not for a dramatic cat eye, but to make the lashes appear thicker and the eyes more defined. Mascara, as we know it, didn't exist in its modern form, but women would sometimes warm a mixture of petroleum jelly and lamp black over a candle and apply it to their lashes with a small brush or even a toothpick. One quirky tidbit: some desperate souls would even apply a tiny dot of belladonna, a highly poisonous plant extract, to their eyes. This would dilate the pupils, making the eyes appear larger and darker, giving them a dreamy, almost drug-like gaze. Of course, the side effects included blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and eventually blindness. It certainly puts those stinging modern mascaras into perspective, doesn't it? The eyebrows were also a point of focus, though again, subtly was paramount. They were typically kept natural, gently defined, and well-groomed, rather than heavily shaped or drawn on. Plucking was minimal, and the ideal was a soft, natural arch that framed the eye without drawing undue attention to itself. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of belladonna was truly a common practice among all social classes, or if it was more confined to those who were either truly desperate for the look or dangerously ill-informed. Regardless, The pursuit of large, expressive eyes remained a consistent thread in Victorian beauty standards, often achieved through methods that were, by our standards, either surprisingly simple or terrifyingly risky. It's almost like they were constantly performing a magic trick, making their eyes appear more captivating through sheer willpower and a dash of danger. With the eyes radiating a luminous, almost fragile intensity, the next subtle area of focus for the Victorian woman was her lips and cheeks. Unlike today, where a bold red lip or a dramatic contour might be commonplace, Victorian beauty emphasized a demure, almost imperceptible enhancement of natural color. The goal was to appear naturally flushed, as if by a sudden burst of modest emotion, rather than overtly made up. Imagine trying to achieve that just pinched look without, actually pinching your cheeks too hard and leaving an unsightly mark. It was a delicate balance indeed. Rouge, in the sense of a vibrant red powder, was generally frowned upon. It was seen as theatrical, something a stage performer might wear, not a respectable lady. Instead, women might subtly bite their lips or pinch their cheeks just before entering a room to encourage a natural blush. This was the ultimate low-tech, high-stakes beauty hack of the era. For those seeking a slightly more consistent tint, gentle, plant-based dyes, or even simple beet juice might be dabbed onto the lips or cheeks. The key was that it should appear as if no artifice whatsoever had been applied. If someone detected your makeup, you had failed. It was a silent agreement, a beauty secret kept between a woman and her mirror, and perhaps her lady's maid. One quirky tidbit about this era of subtle enhancement. Some fashion plates from the mid-Victorian period occasionally show women with a slightly rosier hue than you might expect, hinting that while overt makeup was shunned, a delicate touch was sometimes tolerated, provided it looked completely natural. Historians still argue whether the strictures against visible makeup were universal across all social classes or more pronounced among the upper echelons who had a reputation for gentility to uphold. Regardless, the ideal was always an understated glow, a whisper of health and vitality, rather than a shout. It's almost like they were playing a game of is she or isn't she, with their own faces constantly striving for that elusive, perfectly natural perfection. Remember how they go to great lengths to avoid the sun? They certainly weren't trying to achieve a sun-kissed glow with their cheek color either. Having achieved the ideal subtle blush and luminous eyes, a Victorian lady's pursuit of beauty would inevitably turn to her dental dilemmas. While we might take sparkling white teeth for granted today, maintaining a perfect smile in the Victorian era was a significant challenge, often fraught with pain and surprisingly crude methods. Imagine trying to charm someone with a smile when your teeth are less than pristine and the best dental care involve a blacksmith. It wasn't exactly a recipe for effortless confidence. Oral hygiene, as we understand it, was in its infancy. Toothbrushes made from animal bone and boar bristles did exist, but they weren't universally common, and toothpaste was a far cry from the minty fresh gels we squirt out today. Instead, powders made from crushed cuttlefish bone, charcoal, or even brick dust were used, often with a finger or a cloth, to clean teeth. You can almost feel the grit, can't you? Imagine trying to scrub your teeth with powdered brick. It sounds less like a dental routine and more like an attempt to sand down a piece of furniture. While these abrasive substances might have removed some surface stains, they also likely wore away enamel, leading to further problems down the line. Cavities and tooth decay were rampant. Without modern dentistry, extractions were the primary solution for painful teeth, often performed by barbers or untrained tooth pullers with little regard for hygiene or pain relief. The thought alone is enough to make you wince. For those who could afford it, false teeth made from ivory, bone, or even human teeth, often scavenged from battlefields or purchased from the poor, were available. These were rarely comfortable or natural looking. However, historians still argue whether the prevalence of tooth decay was more due to a lack of understanding of hygiene or simply the sugary Victorian diet, which saw an explosion in confectionery and sweet treats. One quirky tidbit: Queen Victoria herself famously preferred gaps in her smile, apparently finding a full set of perfect teeth somewhat unappealing or perhaps too artificial. This personal preference might have subtly influenced what was considered acceptable at court, but it certainly didn't stop the general public from striving for a more complete, if not always healthy, set of pearly whites. With the face and hair meticulously attended to, the Victorian beauty ideal extended to areas you might consider less immediately visible, the hands and feet. While perhaps not as overtly showcased as the corseted waist or elaborate hairstyle, these extremities were still subject to their own set of expectations, speaking volumes about a woman's refinement and social standing. Imagine trying to navigate a bustling London street in a voluminous gown, all while trying to keep your delicate gloves pristine. It was a subtle performance, wasn't it? For hands, the ideal was softness, whiteness, and delicacy. They were rarely, if ever, seen without gloves when a woman was out in public, even indoors at formal gatherings. This wasn't just about fashion. It was also a practical measure to protect the skin from sun exposure, again with the paleness obsession, and harsh elements, ensuring they remained unblemished and soft. A lady's hands were not meant for manual labor. They were for holding a teacup, a fan, or perhaps a small embroidery hoop. Nails were kept clean, neatly filed, and buffed to a natural shine, but never painted with color. That would have been considered shockingly vulgar, akin to shouting in a quiet library. One quirky tidbit: some women would sleep in cotton gloves coated with various emollients, like almond oil or glycerin, to ensure maximum softness by morning. It's the historical equivalent of your overnight moisturizing mask, only a bit more cumbersome. As for feet, the focus was on smallness and daintiness. Victorian shoes, often made of soft leather or satin, were designed to be narrow and fitted, emphasizing a petite foot. While less exposed than hands, the ideal was still clear. A small foot implied a delicate frame and a life free from strenuous activity. Comfortable shoes, as we know them today, were certainly not a priority, and many women suffered from bunions and foot deformities due to ill-fitting footwear. Historians still argue whether the extreme emphasis on small feet led to practices akin to foot binding in some Western societies, albeit less severe, or if it was simply a natural outcome of prevailing fashion and the general ideal of delicacy. Remember that iron grip of the corset we talked about? Well, imagine a similar, though perhaps less medically alarming, constriction around your toes. You wouldn't be running any marathons in those shoes, that's for sure. As we gently move from the minutiae of hands and feet, it becomes clear that fashion itself was an integral part of Victorian beauty. It wasn't simply about adornment. Clothing was the very framework within which the ideal Victorian woman was presented. The silhouettes, the fabrics, the intricate details all conspired to enhance and define the beauty standards of the era. Imagine trying to explain minimalism to a Victorian lady. She'd probably think you were suggesting she wore a nightgown to a ball. The layers were astonishing. Beneath the outer gown, a woman would wear chemises, petticoats, and of course, the ever-present corset. These undergarments were not just practical. They were essential for creating the desired shape and volume. The iconic bell-shaped skirts of the early Victorian era, often supported by numerous layers of petticoats, gradually gave way to the crinoline, a monumental cage-like structure that allowed for even wider skirts. Then came the bustle, emphasizing the derriere, and finally, the slimmer, more tailored lines of the late Victorian period. Each shift in fashion created a new, though equally rigid, canvas for the female form. It's almost like they were constantly re-engineering themselves to fit the latest architectural trend in clothing. Fabrics played a crucial role too. Luxurious silks, satins, velvets, and fine wools draped beautifully, adding to the opulence and perceived delicacy of the wearer. Delicate lace, embroidery, and intricate trimmings were not just decorative. They were markers of status and good taste, hinting at the hours of skilled labor that went into creating each garment. A dress was a statement, a silent announcement of a woman's wealth, social standing, and adherence to polite society's expectations. Historians still argue whether the extreme impracticality of some Victorian fashions like the enormous crinoline, was a deliberate attempt to restrict women's movement and keep them confined to the home, or simply the natural evolution of an aesthetic preference for grandeur. One quirky tidbit: some Victorian ladies wore tiny, almost hidden pockets, or reticules, as they were sometimes called, concealed within their voluminous skirts, allowing them to carry small personal items without disrupting the smooth line of their gown. It's like the original hidden phone pocket, only for smelling salts and a tiny lace handkerchief. Now, while we've gently explored the painstaking rituals of Victorian beauty, it's important to remember that not every woman could aspire to the same standards. Class and affordability played an immense, often invisible, role in dictating who could truly embody the ideal Victorian lady. Imagine trying to achieve that porcelain complexion when you're spending your days working in a smoky factory or scrubbing floors. It simply wasn't a universal reality. For the upper classes and the aspiring middle class, beauty was a pursuit supported by leisure, money, and domestic staff. They could afford the finest fabrics, the most skilled dressmakers, and the various lotions and potions that promised youth and pallor. They had the time to spend hours on elaborate hairstyles and intricate corsetry. Their days were not spent in physically demanding labor, allowing their hands to remain soft and their complexions unblemished by the sun. The leisure itself was a beauty accessory, a visible sign of their elevated status. Historians still argue whether the extreme emphasis on physical delicacy was a genuine aesthetic preference or a deliberate social construct to further differentiate the wealthy from the working poor. However, for working-class women, these ideals were largely unattainable, if not entirely irrelevant. Their lives demanded practicality over pretense. Sun-kissed skin was an unavoidable reality of outdoor work, and soft, uncalloused hands were a luxury they couldn't afford. Corsets, if worn at all, were often simpler, less restrictive models, necessary for supporting heavy work clothes rather than achieving an extreme silhouette. Their beauty routines were far more basic, relying on simple soaps, perhaps a bit of pomade for their hair, and whatever natural remedies were passed down through generations. They focused on cleanliness and neatness rather than elaborate adornment. One quirky tidbit: while upper-class women avoided the sun, working-class women might have subtly enhanced their complexion with natural berries or even a touch of soot around the eyes, adopting a more earthy aesthetic driven by necessity. It's almost like there were two parallel universes of Victorian beauty, each defined by their daily realities and the contents of their pocketbooks. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we briefly mentioned? Even that would have been an expensive luxury for many. While our journey tonight has largely focused on the intricate world of Victorian female beauty, it's worth taking a gentle detour to consider men's beauty standards during this era. Though less overtly discussed, and certainly less restrictive than for women, Victorian gentlemen were by no means exempt from the prevailing ideals of appearance and presentation. Imagine a world where a well-groomed beard spoke volumes, and a perfectly starched collar was a silent mark of respectability. Men had their own subtle battles to fight in the mirror, though perhaps without the threat of arsenic poisoning. The ideal Victorian gentleman exuded an air of dignified masculinity, respectability, and prosperity. This wasn't about flashy adornment, but rather about meticulous grooming and appropriate attire that subtly conveyed status and good breeding. Cleanliness was paramount. A well-scrubbed appearance, neat hair, and carefully trimmed nails were expected. Unlike the women's porcelain paleness, a healthy, albeit not overly tanned, complexion was generally preferred for men, hinting at an active outdoor life without suggesting manual labor. It was a balance, a gentleman's glow, not a farmer's tan. Hair was typically kept relatively short and neatly parted, often styled with pomades or hair oils to achieve a smooth, glossy finish. Wavy or curly hair was often straightened to achieve a sleek, controlled look. Beards and mustaches underwent significant shifts in popularity throughout the era. In the early Victorian period, clean-shaven faces were common, but by the mid-1850s, facial hair became incredibly fashionable, often seen as a sign of virility, wisdom, and maturity. Think of the bushy, impressive beards sported by figures like Prince Albert. Maintaining these beards required careful grooming, brushing, and the application of beard oils or waxes to keep them neat and lustrous. Historians still argue whether the resurgence of facial hair was a direct response to a perceived effeminacy in earlier male fashion or simply a cyclical trend. One quirky tidbit: some gentlemen even use special beard nets to keep their majestic facial hair tidy while sleeping. It's like the male equivalent of those silk bonnets women wore, only for a slightly more bristly purpose. Having explored the subtle nuances of gentlemen's grooming, let's gently shift our focus to a topic that might surprise you when discussing Victorian beauty: hygiene habits. You see, while we envision pristine ladies and dapper gentlemen, the reality of Victorian cleanliness was often far different from our modern expectations, and sometimes, quite frankly, a little murky. Imagine a world where a full bath was a weekly or even monthly event and air fresheners came in the form of potent perfumes. Daily bathing, as we know it, was not a widespread practice, particularly in the early to mid-Victorian era. Indoor plumbing was still a luxury, reserved for the very wealthy, and even then, hot water could be a laborious affair involving fires and kettles. For many, a bath consisted of a sponge bath in a basin, often with cold water, focusing on visible areas like the face, neck, and hands. Undergarments, however, were changed frequently, perhaps daily, as these were believed to absorb bodily odors and keep the outer clothing cleaner. It's almost like they treated their inner clothes as disposable filters. Historians still argue whether the less frequent bathing was due to a genuine fear of waterborne diseases, a simple lack of infrastructure, or cultural beliefs about the drying effect of too much washing on the skin. Hair washing was also an infrequent event, often done every few weeks or even months. Instead of shampoo, women might use diluted ammonia or simply brush their hair vigorously to remove dirt and distribute natural oils. This explains the reliance on elaborate updos. They help conceal hair that wasn't freshly washed. For gentlemen, barbers were essential, not just for shaves and haircuts, but also for elaborate hair oiling and scalp treatments that helped maintain cleanliness and manageability between washes. One quirky tidbit: some Victorian hygiene guides actually recommended against too much washing, claiming it stripped the body of its natural defenses and could lead to illness. It's a curious contrast to our modern obsession with daily showers and antibacterial everything, isn't it? Perhaps they had a point about natural defenses, but I think most of us would still prefer a good lather and rinse. Given the less than frequent bathing habits we just gently explored, it's only natural to wonder how Victorian society managed the inevitable reality of fragrance and odor. In an era before widespread deodorants and daily showers, the art of smelling pleasant, or at least masking less pleasant natural scents, became a delicate and often elaborate endeavor. Imagine a crowded ballroom, filled with hundreds of people, each carrying their own unique combination of natural scent, faint soap, and perhaps a strong perfume. It was an olfactory tapestry, to say the least. Perfumes and colognes were incredibly popular, worn by both men and women. These were often rich, floral, and quite potent, designed to leave a lasting impression and, frankly, to cover up any lingering bodily odors. Scents like rose, lavender, violet, and patchouli were common, sometimes combined in complex formulas that would be considered quite heavy by modern standards. It wasn't just about personal application, either. Homes were often scented with potpourri, sachets of dried flowers, and even diffusers burning fragrant oils, creating a multi-layered olfactory environment. It's almost like they were living in a constant haze of floral musk, a fragrant bubble to ward off the less delightful smells of a rapidly industrializing world. Beyond direct application, there were other fascinating methods. Scent balls, or vinaigrettes, small decorative containers filled with absorbent material soaked in aromatic vinegars or essential oils, were carried by ladies. A quick sniff could revive one from a faint spell or a lingering, unpleasant odor. Men might carry perfumed handkerchiefs, And speaking of peculiar historical practices, did you know that some Victorians believed that bad odors, or miasmas, were direct causes of disease? This belief, though scientifically incorrect, certainly encouraged the use of strong fragrances and disinfectants to purify the air. Historians still argue whether the strong, often cloying, nature of Victorian perfumes was purely a matter of aesthetic preference or a functional necessity born from less frequent personal hygiene. Either way, they certainly weren't shy about making their presence, olfactory-wise, known. As we softly drift further into the Victorian world of beauty, it becomes impossible to ignore a darker, more unsettling aspect of this pursuit: the hazardous ingredients and risky practices employed in the name of achieving the ideal. While the desire for beauty is timeless, the methods used in the Victorian era often crossed into genuinely dangerous territory, a stark reminder that beauty can indeed come at a terrifying cost. Imagine willingly smearing poison on your face, all for the sake of a perfect complexion. It sounds like something out of a Gothic novel, doesn't it? We've already touched upon the use of lead and arsenic in skin whitening creams. These heavy metals, though effective in lightening the skin, slowly poison the user, leading to a host of debilitating symptoms from headaches and nausea to skin discoloration, paralysis, and even death. The long-term effects were often misdiagnosed or simply accepted as the frailties of the female constitution. Then there was belladonna, the deadly nightshade, used to dilate pupils for that alluring, wide-eyed look. While instantly effective, it caused blurred vision, extreme light sensitivity, and could lead to permanent blindness if used consistently. It's a terrifying trade-off, isn't it? A momentary enhancement for a potential lifelong impairment? Beyond these outright poisons, other seemingly innocuous practices also carried risks. The extreme tight lacing of corsets, while historians still argue about the extent of internal organ damage, certainly led to fainting spells, indigestion, and restricted breathing. Voluminous skirts, especially those supported by crinolines, were notorious fire hazards, catching fire from open flames in fireplaces or candles, sometimes with tragic consequences. And the popular trend of using mercury compounds in cosmetics, believed to treat blemishes or brighten the skin, caused tremors, memory loss, and mental instability. One quirky tidbit: some women would even use actual leeches to achieve a pale, delicate appearance by bleeding themselves, believing it would purify the blood and lighten the complexion. It's a testament to the lengths people would go, even when faced with discomfort and peril. The mainstream historical fact here is the widespread acceptance and commercialization of these dangerous products. Beauty ads of the time openly promoted items we would now classify as toxic waste. As the gentle hum of our journey tonight begins to soften, it's time to consider the fascinating legacy and modern echoes of these surprisingly strict Victorian beauty standards. You might think such extreme practices and ideals are firmly relegated to the past, quaint curiosities of a bygone era. But look closely, my dear listener, and you'll find subtle, sometimes surprising, reflections of Victorian aesthetics in our contemporary world. Imagine how much has changed, yet how much of human desire for beauty remains stubbornly similar. First, consider the enduring appeal of the hourglass figure. While the rigid corset has thankfully, for our ribs at least, faded from daily wear, the desire for a cinched waist and amplified curves persists in modern fashion, shapewear, and even cosmetic surgery. The S-bend silhouette might be gone, but its spirit lives on in countless contemporary designs. Then there's the complexion. While a sun-kissed glow is widely celebrated today, the market for skin-lightening products, particularly in certain regions of the world, quietly echoes the Victorian obsession with paleness, demonstrating that ideals of complexion are often culturally rather than universally defined. Remember that porcelain doll look? It's still, in some corners, considered the epitome of refined beauty. And what about the sheer effort involved in beauty routines? While we no longer spend hours coiling our hair into elaborate updos or risking lead poisoning for pale skin, The modern beauty industry thrives on a similar dedication. Think of multi-step skincare routines, elaborate makeup tutorials, and a constant quest for the perfect selfie. We might use different tools and substances, but the time commitment, the pursuit of an ideal, and the economic investment remain remarkably consistent. Historians still argue whether our modern beauty practices are truly less harmful than those of the Victorian era, given the proliferation of highly processed ingredients and the psychological pressures of social media. One quirky tidbit that connects the eras: the resurgence of interest in vintage fashion and cottagecore aesthetics often draws directly from Victorian and Edwardian romanticism, reinterpreting their softer, more flowing lines for a modern, comfortable sensibility. The idea of delicate elegance, even if achieved through entirely different means, seems to have a timeless allure. So, as we gently pull back from the gaslit streets and hush parlors of the Victorian era, you might find yourself looking at your own reflection a little differently. Perhaps with a renewed appreciation for comfortable clothing, the safety of modern cosmetics, and the freedom to embrace whatever shade your skin naturally achieves. The Victorians, in their rigorous pursuit of beauty, have left us a legacy not just of peculiar practices, but of a profound human desire to present an ideal self to the world, a desire that continues to shape our lives, even as we drift off to sleep. The air around you feels softer now, the last whispers of corsetry and arsenic fading like old photographs. Your own bed feels immeasurably comfortable, the sheets cool and inviting. Let the images of grand ballrooms and intricate updos dissolve into the quiet comfort of your surroundings. Your mind is calm, your body relaxed, settling deeper into the stillness. The stories have served their purpose, gently guiding you away from the day's concerns. Just breathe now, slowly, deeply, letting each exhale carry away any lingering thoughts, any last traces of the bustling Victorian world. You are safe, you are still, and peace envelopes you.